Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a deeply sobering, honestly incredibly complex report sourced directly from sunnafiles.com. This report, which synthesizes accounts originally documented by writer Tom Levinson in Haaretz, details the severe psychological distress faced by soldiers returning from Gaza. We're going to look strictly at the data and the testimonies provided in this report to unpack a phenomenon that goes way beyond standard combat stress. We'll examine the internal fractures occurring within these soldiers, how the institution responds to it, and finally, the profound implications this holds for the civilian population on the other side.
Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll be covering 1. Defining moral injury, 2. Testimonies from the field, 3. The museum breakdown, 4. Institutional silence, and 5. The cost to civilians. Section 1. Defining moral injury, the psychological baseline. To truly understand the testimonies detailed in the sunnafiles.com report, we really need to figure out what's happening internally to these soldiers. Why aren't standard treatments for combat stress working? Well, the crucial point here is that we aren't just talking about fear, or the adrenaline of combat, or even your traditional PTSD. We are talking about moral injury. This is defined as severe psychological distress resulting from actions, or crucially, the failure to prevent actions that fundamentally transgress a person's deeply held ethical beliefs. This isn't just a reaction to danger, it's a fundamental fracture in a person's ethical foundation, leading to what the report actually calls a complete moral collapse. Section 2. Testimonies from the field, confronting the reality. With that clinical baseline established, let's look at how this actually manifests. The Sunna Files report documents several chilling accounts of soldiers facing severe trauma not from enemy combat, but from their own complicity. For instance, the report opens with Yuval, a 34-year-old software engineer. He recounts a raid in Khan Younis where his unit stormed a location only to find an elderly man and 3 unarmed boys. According to his testimony, all were shot dead. Yuval describes his profound shock when his commander then spat on the bodies while shouting degrading insults. Now, Yuval remained completely silent during this. He later described himself as a coward, unable to respond, stating that literally no amount of prayer could compensate for what had taken place. Then we have Maya, a philosophy student and HR officer, who shares a similarly harrowing account. She talks about an incident where 5 unarmed Palestinians were killed and subsequently buried with a bulldozer. She also witnessed soldiers laughing while humiliating a bound and blindfolded detainee. The psychological impact on her was just immense. She describes feeling entirely overwhelmed by hypocrisy, struggling to understand how she, someone who viewed herself as ethical, could just remain silent. She says her life essentially fractured into 2 incompatible realities. Eitan's testimony underscores this internal collapse even further. He details the severe abuse inflicted on detainees during interrogations by a specific unit, noting that the methods were brutal and degrading. For Eitan, the psychological cost is auditory, and it's incredibly persistent. The screams of a prisoner continue to resonate with him, absolutely shattering his previous belief in the ethical conduct of the military. And this perfectly illustrates the inescapable internal conflict highlighted across the board in the report. It's not just infantry. A sniper reports being haunted by the faces of his targets, completely unable to detach. We hear about Ran, an Air Force officer who experienced severe internal conflict after planning retaliatory airstrikes that he knew would cause civilian casualties. He eventually left the service, feeling like he'd betrayed his own moral framework. Now he engages in obsessive self-directed distress, constantly searching for images of victims to see if he was responsible for their deaths. The trauma here is just pervasive. Section 3. The museum breakdown, a collision of past and present. Let's move to a particularly striking account from the source that shows how this suppressed trauma doesn't just fade away, right? It violently surfaces when triggered by the most unexpected things. According to the report, a soldier named Yehuda witnessed an officer kill an unarmed Palestinian who had raised his hands in surrender, an event later officially classified as the killing of a militant. Yehuda suppressed this. But later, while standing in an empty art gallery, specifically the Museo del Prado in Madrid, he experienced a total psychological breakdown. He was looking at a painting by Francisco Goya that depicted a defenseless man facing execution. The source emphasizes that the visceral friction between the art on the wall and his suppressed memory of Gaza triggered uncontrollable emotional distress. The painting perfectly mirrored the reality he saw, and it literally broke him. He was left with profound, ongoing shame, constantly questioning how he became someone who remained passive instead of acting. It is a devastating, textbook example of moral injury surfacing. Section 4. Institutional silence and stigma, reframing the trauma. So, how is this epidemic of psychological distress actually being handled? Well, according to the Sunna Files report, despite clinics seeing a massive spike in cases, there is a systemic containment of this trauma within the military apparatus itself. Notice the stark contrast here between the institutional narrative and the clinical reality. The military attempts to politically reframe these conditions as identity injury. It's a softer term, right? One that carries way fewer political implications. But the clinical reality, as stated by suicide prevention experts in the report, is moral injury. And moral injury requires a deeply difficult treatment centered on self-forgiveness, a process a lot of these soldiers find utterly unattainable. Because of this institutional reframing, a deep silence takes hold. You might be wondering, why aren't more speaking out? Well, the report outlines the drivers of this silence very clearly. There's a profound fear of being labeled weak by peers or seen as disloyal to the unit. They exist in a societal environment that heavily emphasizes strength and retaliation. So consequently, these soldiers are choosing to silently endure horrific internalized conflict and private distress, rather than risk the immense institutional and social stigma of moral confrontation.
Section 5, the cost to civilians, the ultimate conclusion. This brings us to the final and frankly the most devastating logical deduction we can draw from the sunnafiles.com report regarding the furthest ripple effect of this trauma. The report explicitly notes that the human cost of war extends beyond its immediate victims to the soldiers themselves. But as objective analysts here, we really have to hold a mirror up to that trauma. Just think about the logic for a second. If the perpetrators, soldiers who are heavily armed, backed by a well-resourced military institution, and returning to a functioning society, if they are experiencing total mental and moral collapse simply from committing or witnessing these acts, then the psychological destruction inflicted on the defenseless, innocent victims who actually have to survive these acts is almost unfathomable. It points to a catastrophic, multi-generational tragedy. And that leads us directly to this final, incredibly heavy question. If those carrying out the orders are fundamentally broken by the sheer inhumanity of the events they're participating in, what is the long-term psychological consequence for the innocent civilian survivors enduring them day after day? It's a profound question, derived entirely from the insights provided by sunnafiles.com. It highlights this invisible, incalculable cost of conflict, and it is exactly what I want you to take away and deeply reflect on from today's explainer. Thanks so much for joining me.